Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Denver Dzogchen podcast. I'm your host, Damian Abel. I am here once again with Joseph Wagner, and we are following up on last time's discussion. And if you're starting to notice that these podcasts are coming out on our Dzog days, right? So as Vajrayana practitioners, there's two really important days every month that one's dedicated to the guru and one's dedicated to the Dakini. And so we're going to be releasing the podcast as consistently as we can on those days. So you'll see that it's coming out on those days and you'll know to look for it. And it also, when you see your YouTube or whatever, remind you that we're coming out. It'll also remind you to do your Dzog practice because that's an important part of being a Vajrayana practitioner. And I think it's also important to connect us to this lunar cycle, right? Because there's something special about the lunar calendar, and it has this benefits when we kind of stay connected to like what phase the moon's in. These are important things in our tradition. So I'm hoping by having our podcast come out on these days, it'll help connect, be one more reminder for you and help connect you to this different way of approaching the world. And having a lunar orientation is one way we can relate to that. But what we prompted from our last discussion was we were talking a lot about love and connection and relationship and its importance in the Vajrayana. And I can't tell you the number of times in my life I've heard people tell me, I can't do visualization. I don't know how to visualize. Visualization is too hard. I really struggle with visualization. And Joe, one time you mentioned that one of your mentors, Eric Drew, told you that it's not visualization, it's feelingization. And I think that's a really important point because even Trunpga said this, right? Like it's not a technicolor experience, is the way he said it. And I think that's right because we tend to think of it's like television, right? And that's not exactly what we're going for. So maybe you can say what is visualization in your understanding? How is it cultivated, and what do people do who struggle with it?
Well, hello, Damien, and thank you. And hello, everyone. It's a giant topic, and I'm not a super expert, but I'll just give my own experience and what I've gathered to some degree. The path of Vajrayana is different from, in a sense, has a slightly different emphasis than Theravada or Mahayana in that we have different sorts of skillful means, and the primary skillful means aspect or the way to look at what we're doing on the Vajrayana path is transformation. And the transformation ultimately is from our perception of the world as an ordinary place of confusion and trouble into a pure place, a pure realm. In fact, the hallmark of the Vajrayana is pure perception. And just like the hallmark of Mahayana is bodhicitta and the hallmark of Theravada is renunciation, the hallmark of Vajrayana is its power of transforming our experience into one that is pure. And in fact, the outcome of the practice is that you see everything as pure and you see all beings, including yourself, as enlightened masters, as Buddhas and Devas, Dakinis, whatever. This process is activated and encouraged through visualization, which is imagination, creative imagination, usually of highly evolved beings, Buddhas, right? Which we relate to as the primary practice in Vajrayana is done in seated meditation, visualizing oneself as a Buddha or a yidam, and visualizing the outside world as the palace in which that deity abides, and so forth. And then reciting the mantra while realizing or recognizing or training in one's absolute nature, one's purity of inner nature. The visualization aspect is usually trained first because it's maybe most important. And I hear the same thing from people that you are talking about, that, oh, I can't visualize, this is very hard. We really want to not think of it as a static thing that we're like imagining with all of our mental powers. I've been told not only by one of my mentors, who said, emphasize it as a feelingization, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But in my very early days, I was another one of my mentors was Richard Arthure, Kungadawa. Some old time practitioners would know him because he was a very early, I think the first secretary of Chogyam Trunpga Rinpoche. And at one point they went on a trip for more than a year to Asia and spent some time in Bhutan. And at that time, they did a retreat at Taksang, one of the places of Guru Rinpoche, where Trungpa Rinpoche revealed a hidden treasure, a terma, called the Sadhana of Mahamudra. And Richard was a great poet and a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company at one point, and just an amazing person, actually. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but an amazing being, and had a terrific command of the English language. And he and Trungpa Rinpoche together wrote the English version of the Sadhana of Mahamudra, which is far more widely practiced than the Tibetan version. I'm not sure if even Tibetans do it in Tibetan. I don't know. I'm sure they, to some degree. So Kunga, Richard, told me that Trungpa Rinpoche, when Richard was doing the Nundro, one part of the Nundro, as you know, is Vajrasattva, the Buddha of, like the chief Buddha of the Nyingma school, above your head, and nectar flowing down from Vajrasattva and purifying your obscurations of your body, speech, and mind. This is in while you recite the long Vajrasattva mantra. Richard was having a hard time with this because he was like, well, how am I supposed to see Vajrasattva? Am I looking up and trying to look up his skirt? Like, this is bizarre. Like, this was his kind of question. And he told me that he asked from Rinpoche about that. And he said, you know, it's like wearing a baseball hat. You know you've got it on, but you can't see it. I thought that was very interesting. And I've held on to that. That must have been 30 years ago, 25 years ago, he told me that. And I think the visualization is more like that. I shouldn't say it's more like that. I was just recently reading the autobiography of Khenpo Ngawang Palzang, Khenpo Nachung, who's an incredible, great master and emanation of Vimalamitra. I recommend that for those who are advanced practitioners, because it's not a beginner book. It's not that interesting from a beginner perspective, but it's amazing if you're an advanced student. At least it has been for me. And he goes into great detail of all the instructions he received from his Lama, who was a direct disciple of the famous Patra Rinpoche, about how to visualize. And he was so precise, and that is the way you should do it. If you can do it that way, this is the way to do it. It's more powerful. It's more in line with the tradition. It causes a deeper and faster transformation of the mind. That said, most practitioners who are going to hear this podcast are like me and you. They're practitioners in the world. You've got a job. I've got a job. You've got a family. I've got a family. We have lots of things we've got to do. We're not full-time practitioners. We're not Khenpos. We're not monks and nuns. As a result, it seems, and this is just Joe's opinion, this is not the official opinion of anything or anyone, it's not even my official position, that if you find, my position here now for those of us who are living in the world, is that if you find that visualization is nothing but frustration for you, it's better to work with it as a feelingization. As you mentioned, one of my mentors and friends who I love a lot and is a great yogi, Eric Drew, he told me that feelingization captures it better than visualization. We are very visually dominant creatures. Our eyes are by far our most important sense. They're the whole basis of our interaction with the world, both externally and also internally. When you think about something, you see it in your mind's eye. The visual context is extremely powerful. So of course we have to have that, and the way to support that is, looking at a picture of the yidam. But ultimately in our, at the level of Vajrayana that's practiced these days, Maha Yoga level for the Nyingmas, or Anuttara Tantra for the Sarma schools, you are the yidam. It is very hard to see yourself except from outside. Now, there are some aspects of this where there's an outside deity, and you are also the deity. This other stuff I'm not getting into. That's something you can read about or learn from your teacher. But the most important thing, it seems to me, what provides the best basis for the practices to be effective is to feel in yourself how it would be and how it is, I guess, ultimately, to be the yidam, to be Guru Rinpoche or Tara or whatever. And that is more about the feeling it brings up than seeing it in your mind's eye. That is important, and you need to train in it, otherwise it doesn't have much effect. But while training in that, you also get into this feeling. That feeling's called divine pride, the pride of being the deity. It's not like our normal pride, which is like, I'm way better at pickleball than those guys, or whatever sad thing you're into. That's talking about Joe here. But it's a special kind of pride based on what it would be like to be an actual manifestation of the unity of rainbow-like appearance as perfection, well, empty in essence. And that unity is the Vajrayana. It's the main insight of Buddhism generally, but it's also what you're specifically training in when you're doing the yidam practice.
Yeah. Well, a few things this brings up for me that in my experience, number one, after being on this path for a while, I've realized that visualization to some extent is a result more than it is a method.
Interesting.
So in some ways, I practice the practice and practice it and practice it. And in the beginning, I don't see crap. But over time, it starts to manifest. And particularly in the style of Tulku Urgyen, for those of you who've had Dzogchen instructions, he would literally say, just have the thought, I am Guru Rinpoche, and then abide in the view. And then that's the whole practice, is just abiding, or even have a flash, just one flash of the visualization. And if it instantly appears, good. If not, so what? Move on and just abide in the view while you practice the mantra. That instruction's given in all his books. And so what my experience is, if you kind of have that looseness about it, just know it's there, just know I'm the deity, or just know the deities are around me, like just know the baseball hat's on your head. Just sustaining that knowing over time has resulted in a visualization that I can quote unquote see. And when they talk about like the seeing the whites of the eyeballs and like really precise visualization, to me that's only occurred with practices I've done a lot. But I feel like some people, myself included, had the feeling that we weren't really doing the practice until we had that visualization, and then we were supposed to maintain that through the whole time. But to me, it's more like a fruition. It's like once you've really done it, then the visualization's clear, not the other way around.
I think that's nicely said. In a sense, when you are, imagining yourself, and it might be better to just call it imagining yourself, because that's something that isn't so based on seeing it, right? Yeah. It's all together. If you have people say they're not good at visualization, but if you say like, can you imagine what it would be like for your favorite actor or actress to just suddenly knock on your door, and you open your door and see them, you can see it, they can see it perfectly. So it's just that they're not good at visualizing Tara or whatever. They're not that they're not good at imagining things. So maybe we think about it as imagination. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true. The more you do it, the better it gets. So I take this as an opportunity to say, the path is long. People want instant gratification, not instant gratification. They want instant results. These days, with AI on your phone, you can say like, how far away is the moon? And it's got it exactly for today, because the moon is not the same distance all the time or whatever. We have this way of reaching instantaneousness, which we love, of course. You sometimes you order something from Amazon, it's delivered the same day. It's absurd, right? It's absurd. Yeah. On the spiritual path, it's a lot more gradual. And it's important to hear that, and it's important to remember that and remind yourself of that and be reminded by others, because otherwise you're just like, this isn't working. I've been meditating for almost 15 minutes and I'm not enlightened. What is this? It's It's a long path. And it's the same thing for visualization. We are immersing ourselves again and again in a new way of seeing ourselves and a new way of seeing the world. But by combining the three aspects, right? The imagination of oneself as the deity, the recitation of the deity's mantra, and the insight into the nature of reality, that is the mind of the deity, by practicing those again and again and again, I don't want to say like, I don't want to be all dualistic about it, because where are the deities ultimately? But it is, the blessings will enter based on these three things. And I think this is this leads me to another. I can return to this, how long it takes, but my teacher, Lama Norsok Rinpoche, who I've mentioned in other podcasts, the one who produced the ring cell from his hair, and the guy was like an Indian Mahasiddha, not a regular being on any level. I mean, his kudung, his physical body, did not decay, and you can see pictures online, and there are ring cell coming out of it right now. It's like an absurd situation. The guy was amazing. He said something very interesting that I think is useful for people who might be hearing this podcast. He told me something. Someone asked a question, and we had a group of a couple people there, and someone asked a question about, isn't it the only thing that's really important, recognizing the view of Rigpa, the Trekcho practice of Mahmud, this kind of thing. And he said, many people say that. Many people come to me and they say, all I do is Trekcho. I just sit there. And then he said, and they said, will that lead to enlightenment? He said, that's not my experience. He said, one must engage in the yidam practice, in the visualization, the three aspects that I just mentioned, so that the blessings of the view of the meditation itself have a place to land. I thought this was extremely profound and interesting. And here's a guy who spent 50 years living in a cave. I visited the cave as spontaneous Oma hung on the wall. The guy really did it. He lived there for many years. And he said, and he was like a fully enlightened Buddha, as far as I could tell. And he said, just recognize the nature of mind is not the only thing. The Vajrayana is a whole world. And the main aspect is this practice of the yidam. So I wanted to, you gave me this softball, so I'm going to hit that softball in saying that it's important to practice the yidam.
Mm-hmm.
I do not agree with people who say like, oh, that stuff doesn't matter. It's only about Dzogchen stuff or whatever. There are certain people that's true for. But if you meet lamas, if you go to, I've spent a lot of time with Tibetan masters in India, in Nepal, and in Tibet. And when you see them and you live with them, when you spend time with them, what are they actually doing? They're reciting mantras. They're doing visualization practices. They are not just spacing out, looking at the sky all the time. That's not what they're doing. It's a fact. I mean, it's a small sample size, but I would say I've spent significant time with 15 masters, 10, 20 masters, and they all are doing that stuff. So it must be important. So don't let that out of your sight, not you, but our listeners who think like, oh yeah, yidam practice, that's just beginner stuff. That's not the case. All the way to the end, these things flow together. And that's the case that's true for all aspects of the practice. It isn't only about some kind of our idea of what the meditation is really about. It's the whole thing all together. And you get this every time Garchen Rinpoche opens his mouth. And he talks about this all the time, and it's not only about love. It's also about the recitation. It's also about recognizing who's the one who has the love, all this stuff together. So anyway, I kind of went everywhere there, but passing it on.
Yeah, and that's my experience as well. These really important qualities. So like they go together with the view, right? So we need like the insight into the nature of mind, but every Dzogchen master I've ever heard emphasize Guru Yoga endlessly. Well, what is that really about? Well, that's like putting devotion in together with the view, right? So what is it to do Guru Yoga? It's to have the feeling of the presence of your guru. When you have great faith and openness, that kind of infinite possibility, that sense of infinite possibility, that sense of great love, that sense of great openness, we're cultivating our access to that emotional feeling state by doing guru yoga, so that at any time we can feel that. And when we feel that, then the view is so much easier to access. We can't to just access it from our normal state of conceptual mind. It just doesn't work very well. And the same thing for divine pride. So we have this, like, when you have the feeling of like what it's like to be I am a Buddha, you can have the kind of confidence, and there's an emotional feeling tone of that mixes with our experience of our insight, and that allows us to sustain the insight, as Lama Norsok said, somewhere for it to land, because it doesn't and I don't think there's ever been a Dzogchen teacher who didn't say that, like, you have to have compassion, devotion, and divine pride. These seem to be like the main things that make the view even possible.
Beautifully said. And we are emotional beings. It's emotional defilements that cause us our suffering. It's not intellectual defilement. We do have those, but that's most Westerners, in my experience of traveling quite a bit in Tibet, actually, and meeting masters who have no Western disciples, who have no contact with Westerners at all, really, is that they think we're really smart. I've heard them say things like, wow, these guys are like Khenpos. They know everything. And we're just regular people, right? It's not, I'm no Khenpo. But the average Tibetan is not as intellectual. If that was enough, we would all be enlightened, but none of us are enlightened. And the reason is because we rely so heavily on our intellectual way of looking at things, while kind of simultaneously ignoring and being controlled by our emotional side. We really have to bring these together. We have to bring these together. And that's the importance of just what you said, devotion and compassion, and even divine pride is part of this. These are emotional, they are feeling tones that by cultivating them, doors in our heart open, not our physical heart, but our blockage heart, our part of us that's blocking us from the unification and unity that is behind our perception of duality, the real state of affairs, so to speak. We must pop those balloons. We have to break down those walls. And in our tradition, devotion and compassion are the number one way to do that. Reflecting again and again on how much we have in common with all beings and how painful their lives are. Whether it's the bunny that lives in my yard, or the people who are suffering in the Middle East right now, or in, the fighting between Ukraine and Russia, whatever, that develops immediate compassion. You feel like tears start to well up, which is actually a sign of accomplishment, that you're not as hard as you were. I myself am a very hard-hearted person, and it's taken years for me to be able to cultivate this. On the other side, there's devotion, which I was very fortunate that my early experiences of both my Chinese teachers when I was a Zen practitioner, and then especially Tulku Urgyen, really poked seemingly a permanent hole in my heart. And all I have to do is think about those masters and how awesome they are, and the emotional sense of the possibility that they represent is immediately revealed. And it's exactly the same with the yidam practice, which we've been talking about. It's not just about mantras. It's not just about imagining yourself. It's about the feeling tone of what it's like to be Guru Rinpoche, of what it's like to be Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara, in one of his forms, has 1,000 arms. And on every arm, in every hand, there's an eye. And those hands, what do they see? They see the suffering of beings, right? What do those eyes perceive? And that causes your heart to soften and to open. And it's in that openness that the real view can be recognized. Otherwise, it's just an intellectual idea. It's just not having thoughts or unifying with space. These are just words, right? When you meet a Tibetan Lama or any of these great masters, even non-Buddhist traditions, you still see it. What is the experience like? It's one of tremendous love. Yeah. It's tremendous. It's a feeling of boundless love.
What you'll be able to put names to this. What's the story of the student who went to this yogi who didn't really talk much, and he was trying to get confirmation on his understanding of Rigpa, and he just kept sitting there staring, and he wouldn't respond. And then finally he just thought of his master and had incredible gratitude for everything he had received. And then the yogi was nodding. Yes,
I
that's it.
recently read this story again. I can't remember the protagonist's names. It's people we know.
Yeah.
I mean, not the yogi was an unknown. But yeah, I think you told the story very well. It is only in devotion and compassion that it's only in love, right? That the actual view can be perceived, or it's not even perceived, it can be experienced, so to speak. And it's also the easiest way. And that's why it's so great to have a teacher who, like, the Dalai Lama, and I recommend everyone follow Garchen Rinpoche. He's the most advanced person outside of Tibet that I've ever met. He's amazing. He is like a real Buddha. And he was in jail, of course, with Khenpo Munsel. He has a special Nyingma lineage from Khenpo Munsel, who is the direct disciple of the master we mentioned in the last, or maybe it was this one, Khenpo Nachong. Khenpo Munsel was one of his chief disciples. And in prison, there was also another master. The reason I met Garchen Rinpoche was because of Nangchen Adi Rinpoche, who was a little bit younger than Tulku Urgyen, but they were friends and connected in Kham before they left. Well, Adi Rinpoche stayed and spent like 25 years in prison. Tulku Urgyen escaped and went to Nepal and India. But I first connected with Adi Rinpoche, and he was I mean, these guys are not humans as far as I'm concerned. And when I heard that he was in prison with Garchen Rinpoche, I was like, I better meet Garchen Rinpoche. And he's the same. Tulku Urgyen, Adi Rinpoche, Garchen Rinpoche, they're the same. They have different, slightly different take on the path, slightly different emphasis in their practice, but that unchanging love that is, I mean, it's the same for everyone. It's bizarre. And I will take this opportunity to say one thing, and then we can finish. A friend of mine used to be a translator for Garchen Rinpoche. And Garchen Rinpoche used to do a lot of travel. He spent a lot of time in Europe. This guy's European. And after one of the interviews, Garchen Rinpoche would see people. These days it's hard to see, but in those days it was easier. And someone came in and asked questions about what was going on in their life, which was primarily problems with their relationship. And this is what lamas always have to, deal with these questions and stuff. And there's a whole podcast of information in there. But anyway, Garchen Rinpoche gave the advice that it was appropriate for that person, whatever. The interview ended, and Garchen Rinpoche turned to my friend and said, what most people call love, that's what I call attachment. Very interesting thing. And there's a lot of depth in that. There's a lot of reflection possible there. What we call love, what I call love, is like what I feel for my wife. I don't feel that for other people. Garchen Rinpoche doesn't have that, as far as I can tell. He seems to love everyone the same. Holy moly. Think about the world if you loved everyone the same. Not only people, also beings. Also, animals and spiders and so forth. This is what we're really looking for. This is the kind of love that we want. It is of one taste. And when you have that, then reflecting back on our conversation in our other podcast, that is what provides the opportunity for pure perception to really arise. And that's the whole purpose of reciting mantras and visualizing yourself as a deity. So summing up what I've said, because I know we're almost out of time, the main thing is the feeling of it. And the feeling of it is primarily love. If you have that, you're on the right path. If you have mostly a hate feeling, you're on the wrong path, so to speak.
Yeah, like even Garchen Rinpoche has talked about how the wrathful deities love more, right? That they're unwilling to put up with even 1 second of your suffering. So that's why they're wrathful, not because they're destroying anything, but because they have to move so quickly to stop you, like a father stopping a child from running into the road, right? That is the energy behind that. So even what we think of as wrathful is really just magnified love, and crazy and intense love. And you mentioned like we have this love for our family, our wife, but how quickly that love turns to enemy or hatred, right? Like even they piss us off, do something, and immediately we shut down, block them off, close all the love valves, and end that connection immediately. That's why, like, that's not love, that's attachment. And so the real love has that emphasis of like things can come or go, they can attack us or love us. It has to have that kind of, it doesn't matter, it stays the same. And that's where it really starts to go from like that kind of ordinary word love to this great love that Garchen Rinpoche talks about, that's really synonymous with the view.
Well said.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you as always. And I just want to thank our listeners. Thank you for following us. And if you have ideas for this, please shoot us an email. If you want us to talk about something specific, you can contact us through the website, denverdzogchen.com. Let us know that you enjoy it. Please like, subscribe, share. Yeah, you know, we're a new podcast, new to this world, and we're trying to explore some of these Buddhist topics that don't get talked about as much, that sometimes especially practitioners who've been doing this for a while have a hard time finding more. You know, there's a lot of entry level stuff, and some of this deeper into these topics isn't that available. So we're hoping to explore some of these things. So I hope you enjoy it. I really appreciate you. And thank you, Joe. And thank you, all of you. Go over to our website, check us out, denverdzogchen.com, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.